All right. Welcome to everybody. Thank you to our host, Yossi and Naomi, if you're there. Also for hosting us tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. Let me begin by saying, God willing, we will also meet next Thursday, which is Hanukkah. There's a beautiful minhag that says, while the candles are burning, that is the most appropriate time to study some Torah, because both the candles and the Torah are called light, or HaTorah, and therefore we combine it and we spread a little extra light, maybe get a little bit of extra inspiration while the candles are burning. So the plan is next week also to discuss the Parsha and Hanukkah with a special emphasis on Hanukkah next week. Okay, let's get to work because we do have some work to do tonight in this topic of Yosef versus Yehuda, the eternal battle of the brothers. Well, there's, as we know, from the very beginning of time, really, you have this sibling rivalry and you have this conflict within the royal family about who will take over the reins of leadership. You see it to some extent with Cain and Hevel, but it certainly begins later when we set up the Jewish royal family. And maybe this is why you have this similar type of scenario in the Hasidic world, where you have very bitter and very extreme rivalry in Hasidic families and Hasidic movements as to who will lead and take charge in behalf of become the Rebbe. I think it's fortunate to some degree that in Lubavitch that dynasty or that battle over the leadership essentially ended because the Rebbe had no children. So I see some of my children and grandchildren here. So hello to you out there as well. So you see this as a constant. We saw it with even back to Yishmael and Yitzchak, where there is this conflict as who is the real leader. It's interesting that the Muslim world, they connect very strongly to Yishmael. As a matter of fact, they have a holiday that commemorates for them the Akedat Yishmael, that Yishmael was the one, not Yitzchak, who was taken out as an offering. So they just kind of substitute one brother for the other, and they lean towards Yishmael. We, of course, totally and completely accept that Yitzchak was the leader of his generation. But, they have this argument because, Yitzchak says that I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. And Yishmael says, well, I was 13 years old, and that's even harder. So Yitzchak comes back and he says, well, I was ready to give my entire body at the Akedah. And they have this kind of back and forth over who deserves more credit and who should be the leader. So, of course, we follow Yitzchak, and the Muslim world follows, or the Arab world, Yishmael. Then, of course, we saw it most prominently with Yaakov and Esav, this battle over who would win the birthright. And the parents were also divided here because the pasuk tells us straight out that Yitzchak loved Esav and Rivka loved Yaakov. So already they were setting up each of their favorite children to be the leader. So we know what happened in the whole story with the Bechorah, the birthright, etc., where Yaakov comes out and he is, of course, the leader. Now Yaakov has some choices to make of his own. Which of his sons, which of the brothers are going to be the leaders? So let's come back a little bit to the mindset of what's going on here in this debate that we're going to see even more deeply in a moment. First of all, Yaakov is also called Yisrael. He beats the angel in the wrestling match, and his prize is he gets a new name, Yisrael, which is later affirmed by Yaakov. But it's a strange double name. First of all, as we've talked about, the angel says, or God says in a sense, no longer will you be called Yaakov, but Yisrael. But he's still called Yaakov. So somebody's not listening to somebody, but he's got a dual personality, this Yaakov and Yisrael. Who are the two personas? And there's different opinions. One opinion is that Yaakov represents the individual person. Yaakov the man, Yaakov the husband, Yaakov the father. But Yisrael represents the national personality, the leader of a nation. So that's why sometimes, but not always, when you see the name Yisrael used instead of Yaakov, it's referring to the grander idea of, in a sense, the father of our nation. That's why we are called B'nai Yisrael, and we're not called B'nai Yaakov. Again, sometimes you'll see both names used, even in terms of the same pasuk. So that's one idea of the two personas of Yaakov Yisrael. There is also another idea, and that is Yaakov, who is the lover of Rachel, and Yisrael, who is the husband of Leah. And they're used kind of at different times. Leah, of course, connects to Esav. She was supposed to marry Esav. I touched a little bit upon this last week, that some of the children born to Leah and Yaakov, or Yisrael, had some tendencies of Esav, some of the DNA of Esav mixed in, because he was supposed to be in the original plan of certainly of Yitzchak. He was going to be one of the Avot, and he was going to marry Leah. It didn't happen, but to some extent, his influence is in there. So now the question comes to Yaakov, who is going to be the leader? Which son will Yaakov choose? Presumably, he has the power to pick the next leader. So he gives this ketonet pasim, this coat of many colors, right? Yosef's technicolor dream coat. He gives it to Yosef. What's the idea behind it? Rav Soloveitchik says it was a kind of robe, a royal robe of many colors. In the old days, you would see, first of all, kings wore these kinds of robes. You also would see Sephardic grand rabbis who would wear these multicolored coats. It's sad that today, essentially, they're not wearing those anymore. They're wearing, again, the typical black suits and white shirts, not like the very flowery, multicolored coats they used to wear. So Rav Soloveitchik says, this was Yaakov's way of saying, this is who I want to be the next leader. And I'm giving him this robe that looks like something a king would wear. So that's one opinion. Or others want to say, no, and this is something perhaps that the brothers of Yosef thought. And one opinion is he was young. Remember, the pasuk says Yaakov loved Yosef because kiben zkunim hulo. He was born to him in his old age. So where the other brothers were out working and Yosef was younger, maybe as a teenager or younger, he would be in the house. So he would be kind of a butler or a bellboy. You know, a butler wears a suit. A bellboy has a colorful suit. Back in my previous carnation, I was actually a bellboy at a hotel for some time back in Chicago. That's where I first met Susie's parents, actually, who came to a wedding where I was working. In any case, that's another story. But the brothers are thinking, this is not a royal robe. This is something that he wore because he was kind of greeting people, a kind of concierge in the house. But clearly one idea is that Yaakov wanted to set the tone right from the beginning. Let's not have any fighting about this, boys. The leader that I'm choosing is going to be Yosef. The brothers, however, they have a different opinion. They don't relate to Yosef as the leader, even though maybe this was what Yaakov was trying to intimate. They don't accept it. You know why? They have another philosophy. Their take on all this is that in every generation there's a bad seed, a bad apple. It was Yishmael with Yitzchak. It was Esav with Yaakov. And now this generation's got to have somebody who needs to be thrown out. Just like Yishmael was thrown out by Sarah, basically, and then Esav was removed from being one of the Avot. So the brothers think, who is the bad seed in this generation? Obviously, it's Yosef. He's arrogant. He's immature. He doesn't have any respect for his elders because all his brothers were older than him. And they say he doesn't even have respect for his fathers. What is that dream he has of the sun and the moon and the 12 stars bowing down to him? Well, or the number of stars in Yosef's dream corresponding to the brothers, but the sun and the moon being his parents. So his father's going to bow down to him? Well, that's a dream that he said, well, it's a prophecy. It's just come to me. It's not like I made it up. But the brothers are thinking, what a chutzpah. He is now going to tell his father to bow down to him. And obviously, they're very, very upset about his dreams that they maintain. Where do dreams come from? What you're thinking about during the day. What you're focusing on in the day comes out at night in your dreams. So he must be thinking, I'm going to be the king of this family. The brothers don't like it. So Yaakov has to contend with this. He knows that there is trouble in the ranks. He knows that the brothers and Yosef don't get along. Let's add a little bit more of a backdrop to the story. Yosef, of course, is favored by Yaakov. He's the only son that is expressly, according to the Pasuk, loved by Yaakov. It doesn't say anywhere that Yaakov loved Yehuda, that Yaakov loved Dan, Zevulun, Yisachar, Naphtali, but it does say that Yaakov loved Yosef. And that, of course, sets up this antagonism with the other brothers. How come Dad only loves him and not us? And then, of course, the other brothers, they're all sons of Leah. And what does the Pasuk say? We talked about it last week, that God recognizes that Yaakov hated Leah. I mean, it's a very, very strong word. It's hard for us to imagine that Yaakov hates Leah, but that is what the Pasuk say. So that creates tremendous jealousy because the boys are always going to stick by their mother. So even though Yaakov's the father, they're thinking, that's not right. He's really dissing our mom and not giving her the proper love and attention and respect that he should. So when Yaakov buys or gets this coat of many colors, that begins to tear the family apart. Indeed, the Gemara says that for the price of a few shekels, however money he paid, it caused this disruption that would ripple through the generations and cause all this tremendous trauma, beginning with the sale of Yosef as a slave into Egypt. Now, Yosef holds, unlike the brothers, he says his take on all this is, I'm the legitimate firstborn. Yaakov loves me. His favorite is Rachel. So, okay, Reuven chronologically is born first, long before Yosef. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. It takes a while till Yosef is born, but he says, nevertheless, I still consider myself the firstborn. Who says you have to be the oldest? After all, we see that in Jewish history, very often, it's not the oldest that becomes the leader. I mean, we'll see this later, right, with Moshe. Moshe is younger than Aaron, but Moshe is the leader. What about David? He's the youngest of the sons of Yishai, the 7 sons. He's got 7 older brothers, and he takes over as king. And then he gives the kingship to Shlomo, to Solomon, who's also not the oldest. So Yosef figures, okay, I'm not the oldest, big deal. Even though we know that technically the oldest is supposed to be the leader, he's supposed to get a double share. But Yosef doesn't necessarily agree with this. And in a sense, remember, Yosef has got these prophetic dreams. Perhaps he also dreamt and knew that later on, some years later, that it is his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who will get a full portion. That means, in essence, he gets a double portion, Yosef. So that convinces him, even though it comes later, but maybe he had some prophetic insight into it, that, you see, I'm going to get the double portion that makes me the firstborn. So I should be the leader. So this is what's going on. All of this is in the background, this intrigue between the brothers. And they each have their own point of view. Yosef thinks he deserves to be the leader. The other brothers don't agree. And as we'll see in a moment, the natural rival to Yosef is Yehuda. But first, just a word where Reuven, in the story of the sale of Yosef, so it's interesting that Reuven and Yehuda, they act in a sense to save Yosef's life and prevent him from being killed. But why do they do it? Each of them have these designs on leadership. Reuven says, I'm the firstborn, okay? Let's face it. Out of the 12 sons, I'm number 1. So I'm going to be most suspect if Yosef gets murdered. I mean, I'm going to be the number 1 suspect, because they'll say, you killed Yosef to get rid of your rival so that you could really be obviously, Reuben's the firstborn to Leah, and Yosef's the firstborn to Rachel. So, okay, you got rid of that firstborn, so you're the only one left. So Reuven says, I better make sure Yosef doesn't get killed. Otherwise, I'm going to be held accountable. Yehuda, he also, although he's definitely part of this plot to sell Yosef into slavery, he also helps. He says, when Yosef's thrown into the pit, he says, if we leave him here, he's going to die. And, no food, exposed to the snakes and the scorpions inside the pit. So Yehuda says, let's take him out and let's not kill him. We'll sell him to this convoy of Yishmaelim, of Arabs coming by on camel, and they'll take him. So Yehuda's thinking is, I'm the strongest of the brothers. I mean, that was established right from the beginning. Yehuda was obviously had this real leadership material. Maybe he was physically strong also. His name means a lion. So he comes up with a roar, and the brothers are afraid of him as well. And Yehuda says, if I let Yosef die, then clearly I'm going to get blamed, because if I say he lives, no one's going to stand up to me. I'm the big man, and nobody's going to challenge me. Indeed, later on, the brothers ironically will blame Yehuda, and they'll say, even though we plotted to do this to Yosef, if you would have stood up and said, no, don't do it, even though you would be outnumbered 9-1, we would not be able to challenge you. And so, in a sense, they blame Yehuda for what happened. And that's one of the reasons why Yehuda then kind of leaves. He leaves the whole family for a while, which is part of the story, which we'll mention in just a moment. But he goes somewhere else because, in a sense, he becomes an outcast, at least for a while. So even though Reuven and Yehuda are part of the plot, they also consider themselves to be the leaders. But this is especially true about Yosef and Yehuda. Ruvain, although he's the firstborn, he does a couple of things that, first of all, it seems like he's not really cut out for leadership. And then he does a couple of things that his father really resents. So he's out of the picture. So it leaves these two competitors and these two possibilities as leader, and they are Yosef and Yehuda. Now, both of them have a long way to go in order to merit being a leader. First of all, it's interesting that it says Yosef goes down to Egypt, Yosef hurad Mitzrayma, and it uses also the same word to go down about Yehuda, that Yehuda also goes down in this story of ultimately impregnating Tamar. Basically, Yosef's descent is physical, but Yehuda's descent is moral. And he takes up with a woman who's a Canaanite. And this, of course, is, there's a whole dispute. Was she really a Canaanite? Because, you know, in the language of the Torah, Canaanite is a bad word, is a real curse word, because that's synonymous with immorality and perversion and depravity. So it's not a good thing. And that's who he takes up with. And he has a business partner who's also from Canaan. And then he looks for a prostitute. So children, cover your ears. And so he really falls morally, but he will ultimately begin to come back on a moral level when he admits that he had this peccadillo with Tamar when she was disguised. And later on, even more so, he will stand up for his youngest brother, Binyamin, when he thinks that Yosef is going to take him captive and do who knows what to him. And he stands up and he says these beautiful words, Nafsho kshura b'nafsho, our souls are tied together. And then he really begins to look like a leader. Yosef is making his own growth journey. And we touched upon this in more detail last year, I remember. But he has to lose his superiority complex, which clearly is expressed in his dreams. And one good way to lose your superiority complex, go to jail. If you're in jail, especially in those days, you know what a jail was? It was literally a pit. Yosef went from pit to pit. He was thrown, you might say his life was the pit. And he was thrown in a pit by his brothers. And then he was thrown in this dungeon, which really was just a hole in the ground. It wasn't the kind of, you know, jails we think of today, right? The country club jails with tennis courts and TV. No, it was a hole in the ground. And so you can't be very pompous and arrogant there. And he isn't. He can't, you know, spend time primping and curling his beautiful hair. And then he befriends the baker and the butler, which is a beautiful way of his expressing that I want to reach out and help someone. It's not only about me, right? Why do you call it an iPhone? Because it's about iPhone, I sounds. But Yosef realizes it can't only be about I and me. He begins to talk to the baker and the butler, and then he gives credit for everything to Hashem. And he says, you know, whatever has happened to me has happened, that my interpretation of the dreams, you know, my ability to, because when he was in Potiphar's house, Potiphar was successful and said, you know, Yosef, everything Yosef touches turns to gold. And he says, it's not me, it comes from God. And that shows a tremendous amount of humility. He's not saying that, you know, it's all me. It's Hashem. And of course, ultimately, Yosef will take care of his family, and he will be the first of the brothers to die, unfortunately. I mean, you know, it's sadly that for all of his ability to live luxuriously as the second in command in Egypt, he dies young compared to his brothers. And again, he's really next to the youngest, but he's the first one to die. Yehuda and Yosef have this ongoing rivalry throughout history, and they face off again and again. It happens at the pit, and it will happen later on in the genealogy of their family, because remember that the first king of Israel, even though the blessing given to Yehuda, and everybody asks this question, what does Yaakov say in his blessing? Lo yasir shevet mi Yehuda, the scepter of kingship will never depart from the lineage of Yehuda, but it's not true, because we see that the first king of Israel is not from the lineage of Yehuda. It is from the lineage of Rachel's, not Leah's family, but Rachel's family, right? With Shaul, who comes from Binyamin. So there too, you have this kind of point counterpoint between king from Rachel, king from Leah. And then ultimately, even though David replaces Shaul and begins the kingship of Beit David, but it doesn't last very long. It only lasts one generation with Shlomo. And then God says, that's it. I'm taking the kingship, or the exclusive kingship, away from Shlomo. In other words, it's going to continue, but it's not going to be exclusive. And now there'll be a second kingdom, and that is going to be primarily, although not exclusively, primarily from Yosef's lineage. All of it from Rachel, but mostly from Yosef. And that kingdom of Israel, which we sometimes call the 10 tribes, because the famous lost 10 tribes, but that kingdom is going to exist side by side with that of Yehuda and David. And it will be represented by Ephraim. When we see this in the tefillot for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we talk about Ephraim, Aben Yakir Li Ephraim. It's not just Ephraim. Ephraim is kind of the symbol of the 10 tribes. And that, of course, is Yosef's son. So you see this counterplay between Yosef and Yehuda and their lineage. These kingdoms, by the way, don't fight each other. We don't have any evidence that they fought a war, but they're completely divided. They don't really have a connection one to the other. But this interplay between these two giants of Yosef and Yehuda goes on forever. We all are familiar, perhaps, even coming, to the end of time, with this concept of Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David, right? Some people think there's only one Moshiach, but they're wrong. There are two Moshiachs. The first Moshiach will come from Yosef, and it will be his tafkid, his task, to prepare the way for the Moshiach ben David. According to some, there will be this cataclysmic war, and he will be the famous general who will lead the war, and he will die in the war. But because of him, we will win the war, and that will usher in the full age of Moshiach with his counterpart, Moshiach from the lineage of Yehuda and David. Just as Yosef prepared the way for his brothers to come to Egypt, set everything up so that they could have, at least in the beginning, a cushy life in Goshen, so too this king from Rachel, and just as the king from Rachel preceded the king from Leah, so Moshiach ben Yosef will give his life to pave the way for Moshiach ben David, and both will become a part of our ultimate destiny. So throughout history, there will be this interplay between Yosef and Yehuda. I like to say that if you take the initial, right, the first letter of Yosef and the first letter of Yehuda, you have the name of God, that they are Hashem's chosen to form ultimately this partnership. And that's what the goal is, and the mission and the dream is, Now, let me just say, since we're ushering in Hanukkah, you see that this rivalry between brothers is something that wasn't just Yosef and Yehuda, and it wasn't just during those times, but it existed, and unfortunately it still exists today. But the story of Hanukkah is also the story of the battle between brothers, because there was not, people think, what is Hanukkah all about? It was a war between Israel and Greece. But that's only partially true. The fact is there are two wars that take place. There's a civil war that comes first, and only when the civil war is over do we have the war against Greece. The first act of war is when Matityahu kills a fellow Jew who is bringing a pig on a makeshift altar, because the Jewish population was largely Hellenized, following Greek culture and Greek way of dress, and even speaking Greek. And the Hashmonaim came along and said, this has got to end, to the extent that there had to be, in a sense, a war to suppress and ultimately drive out these Hellenistic Jews. Matter of fact, and this is the whole idea of the pure oil that is able to sustain the menorah for 8 days. So too the Maccabim, the Hashmonaim, were the pure, undiluted Jews who were able to sustain the nation. And their first task was to de-Hellenize the Jewish people, and only then fight the war against the Greeks. In fact, one of my theories, I haven't seen this, but I believe it, it may very well be, ironically, that it was our war against the Jewish Hellenists that caused the Greeks to come in the first place. Because no doubt the Hellenists sent messages to Greece saying, we're under attack by the Torah Jews, by the faithful halachic Jews, and you've got to come help us. So I strongly believe that that's how the war even started. The Greeks came to save their, you might say, compatriots, the Hellenistic Jews. And that was when we, of course, were able to unite the nation and fight the war against them and defeat them. So in a sense, you know, this concept of a battle between brothers, and sometimes even being a fight to the death, it wasn't only in the time of Yosef and Yehuda, but it's passed down to the generations. And unfortunately, we see this today. We face, to some extent, the same kind of conflict with our fellow Jews that they faced in the time of Hanukkah. Those who would consider themselves quote unquote pure, I don't really like to use that expression because it sounds very, arrogant and conceited, but there are the Jews who are faithful believers. And then, there are the Jews who are more Hellenistic in nature, and they don't believe in any of those things. And sometimes they try to subvert those who do. So the concept of Hanukkah is really coming along to tell us that, and symbolized by the Chanukiah, the menorah, that you can have many branches of Judaism. You can have Hasidim, you can have Mitnagdim, you can have Sephardim, you can have Ashkenazim. You can have different cultures represented in Judaism, like the menorah with the multi-branches, but there has to be one base. The menorah has one base, and that base is essentially a belief in God and the Torah. And from there you can branch out to different customs and different styles, etc. So this is all really encapsulated in this whole conflict that really is seen in its almost entirety in the story of Yosef and Yehuda. Now, if you want to, when it comes time at the end of the story in Vayigash, we have this beautiful haftorah that for Parshat Vayigash that comes from Yechezkel, and he talks about the day coming when Yosef and Yehuda and their descendants will finally come back and they will band together. No two kingdoms and no animosity between the brothers. It's a beautiful Haftorah, very short. I'll read you just a little bit about it. In the Haftorah, Yechezkel says, two trees, two eitzim. It's translated here by Art Scroll as a wooden tablet, but I think it works with trees because we're really talking about, the tree of Jewish life. Take the trees, write on one of them for Yosef, write Ephraim, the Yosef eitz Ephraim, and on the other one, you write that for Yehuda, and these are the two trees. And then you kind of plant them together. You have this kind of cloning of the two trees, and they will grow together into one tree. It says, it's a beautiful idea. Ani lokech et eitz Yosef asher biyad Ephraim v'shivtei Yisrael chaveiro v'natati otam et eitz Yehuda v'asitem le'etz echad. They will become one tree, and this is the dream. And Yechezkel says, Ko amar Hashem, ani lokech et bnei Yisrael mibein hagoyim. I'm going to take the Jewish people out of the nations, asher halchu sham, where they were exiled to and scattered. V'kibatzti otam, I will gather them. V'aveiti otam la'admatam, I'll bring them back to the land of Israel. L'goy echad ba'aretz, one nation in Israel. Umelech echad, no more two kings. One king will be over them. V'lo yu od lishnei goyim, they won't be two separate nations. V'lo yechatzu od lishtei mamlachot, and they won't divide into two kingdoms. This is the dream. V'yashvu ala aretz, they'll live on the land which I gave to Yaakov and his ancestors, and I will make karati olam, brit shalom, brit olam yuotam. I'll make one covenant, one treaty between them, and they will multiply. V'natati et mikdashi b'tocham leolam, and then I will bring back the Beit HaMikdash, says Yechezkel, in the name of God. It's a beautiful Haftorah that sums this all up and says, no more Yehuda versus Yosef, no more brother against brother. They're going to be one tree, one lineage. And we say it, and you probably don't even realize this, every single day in the davening, just before we say the Amidah, when we come to give our pleas before God, what do we say in the intro? Ufdei chinumecha Yehuda v'Yisrael. And God, make come true, actualize that which you promised us. Ne'um is like a vow. Yehuda v'Yisrael. Bring the two of them together, Yehuda and Yisrael, which is, of course, Yosef, right? Yisrael is the one married to Leah who produces Yosef, and the kingdom is called Yisrael as opposed to the other kingdom of Yehuda. And we say before we daven the Amidah, bring everyone back together. This is the dream. This is the Nevuah of Yechezkel. This is the promise of God. This is the essence of Hanukkah, the idea of all of us finally putting aside the differences, coming together, maybe in many branches, that's fine, with one base and one ultimate destiny, Yehuda, Yisrael, all Jews together, and ultimately bringing the two, but the final Moshiach and the building of the Beit HaMikdash when we accomplish what we're supposed to do. B'mehera v'yameinu. Amen. So that's the story of Yehuda and Yosef. It's the two Moshiachs and the two kingdoms and the two trees that ultimately are going to become one tree, one family tree in which all of us belong. So if anybody has a question or comment, you're welcome to say it, and you can unmute yourself. I know some people, let me just read a couple of the chats, that this Haftorah will show Moshiach will come both Yosef and Yehuda combined. Yeah, but I still think it represents it's still, we have a place for Moshiach ben Yosef, Moshiach ben Yehuda, along with this as well. Okay, so we will have a recording for this shiur as we always do. You can go to BKOA video, BKOA videos, and you'll find all these videos there. You can always write me. I can send you a copy of if you missed any, except unfortunately the one on Leah, which is not recorded. But otherwise we try to record them all. So if there are no questions or comments, then I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. We will meet next week, same time, same place. We'll talk more. I'll give you something, more food for thought of Hanukkah as well, although we'll be in the middle of Hanukkah. But feel free to bring your menorot and your Chanukiot, and we'll have our own little Hanukkah party. Shabbat Shalom, Hanukkah Sameach.
Shabbat
Everybody
Shalom.
stay healthy.